Greetings, everyone. On behalf of the Black Alliance for Peace and its Africa team, I'd like to thank the organizers of this counter summit, this great counter summit, and also for inviting us to make a contribution. Today, US-led NATO has become a global axle in the wheel of the US military-industrial complex, which includes 800 military bases around the world in 85 countries. This does not include the 342 military bases in continental US. The US has at least 29 known military bases in Africa. France has 10, and the UK 9, all NATO countries. We can see that the US has far more than any other country and has working relationships with almost all African countries, all controlled by the US empire for the purpose of full spectrum dominance, driven by the ferocious appetites of corporate capital. Now, full spectrum dominance means US military control over land, sea, air, and space, which is the so-called fourth dimension of warfare, to protect US interests and investment, quote unquote. Protect, quote unquote, means guaranteeing operational freedom, and US interest and investment, quote unquote, means securing a variety of valuable mineral economic resources on the continent of Africa, which produce corporate profits, and this is done with the complicit neo-colonial comprador partners for itself and its allies. The forever US war policy at the same time satisfies the economic appetite and material resources needed for the military-industrial complex, which is an integral part of the whole US corporate capitalist economic system. The late Dr. Walter Rodney accurately described the early foundation of colonial Africa's relationship with NATO in his book, which continues today, by the way, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He said, quote, "Needless to say, in the 1950s, when most Africans were still colonial subjects, they had absolutely no control over the utilization of their soil for militaristic ends. Virtually the whole of North Africa was turned into a sphere of operations for NATO with bases aimed at the Soviet Union. There could have been easily developed a nuclear war without African people having any knowledge of the matter. The colonial powers actually held military conferences in African cities like Dakar and Nairobi in the early 1950s, inviting whites of South Africa and Rhodesia and the government of the USA. Time and time again, this evidence points to this cynical use of Africa to buttress capitalism economically and militarily, and therefore, in effect, forcing Africa to contribute to its own exploitation. That's really important. The colonizing countries have managed to do this in several ways, most importantly by ushering in neo-colonial governments that would do the bidding of the former colonizers after nominal independence. Several of Africa's colonizing countries have been part of NATO membership since its founding, such as France, the UK, Portugal, Belgium, and the USA. And therefore, they already had some military bases, or installations at least, in their colonies. The recolonization by way of neocolonialism was largely successful in spite of the fierce opposition and resistance by anti-colonial liberation movements and leaders. This class struggle also manifests itself in the Organization of African Unity, founded in 1963, where there were two contending groups of countries, one group that wanted to remain dependent, with a dependent relationship with the colonizing countries, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, those that opposed the continued colonial relationship. To enable the acceptance of the idea of a benevolent NATO, the colonial powers knew that they had to convince and recruit a neo-colonial class of indigenous Africans who would do their bidding. This divide played itself out in the national liberation movements between those that were friendly to imperialist forces versus those who wanted a real break from colonialism. The great Kwame Nkrumah explains in his book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, that the wide array of methods employed by neocolonialism ranging from economics, politics, religious, ideological, and cultural spheres. To do this, NATO works hand in hand with other mechanisms of imperialism like the CIA, which was instrumental in the coup against the Kwame Nkrumah government and the murder of Patrice Lumumba, in which case the UN forces also were used as a tool to abort the anti-colonial government of Patrice Lumumba in 1960. Other countries that offered organized resistance to colonialism and neocolonialism included, for example, the Portuguese colonies, as was mentioned. As mentioned, Portugal was also one of the founding 12 NATO members. The great freedom fighter of Africa, Amilcar Cabral, called Portugal a rotten appendage of imperialism. He explained that Portugal, as the most underdeveloped country in Western Europe, would never be able to launch 3 colonial wars at the same time in Africa without the help of NATO. Furthermore, NATO, a creation of the US, uses Portugal and its colonies as part of the larger objective of domination of Africa and the world. Portugal concluded a vicious war against its colonies in Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, Angola, and Mozambique, much like the US did in Vietnam. In both cases, colonizing powers used the most modern weapons, including napalm, cluster bombing campaigns, killing thousands against guerrilla armies that refused to bow down. The Portuguese dictator Caetano was forced to give up economic interest in Angola to some of the NATO powers in exchange for NATO armaments and supplies. Yet, in spite of that, Portugal still lost the war against the heroic anti-colonial forces. The US NATO and US Africa Command, which is an appendage of the US NATO military command structure, all played a devastating role in the destruction of Libya in 2011. It is important to highlight this because it offers some important lessons. First, US imperialism and its NATO lackeys do not tolerate any country that charts an independent path of development, one that refuses to cow down to US hegemonic interests. Secondly, it also demonstrates how NATO can work hand in hand with other US Western-dominated world structures, like the United Nations. In 2011, the UN Resolution 1973 gave political authorization for quote-unquote no-fly zone and a blockade of Libya to implement its purported quote-unquote responsibility to protect some citizens, which ultimately resulted in the destruction of Africa's most prosperous country. US-led NATO forces launched a bombing campaign that lasted 7 months and killed tens of millions of people, civilians, and tens of billions of dollars in property and infrastructure damage. This shows how, although US-led NATO sometimes uses the United Nations for political cover, it has no problem illegally overstepping its mandate, its UN mandate, to commit crimes against humanity and achieve its regime change goals. The illegal US-NATO war on Libya will be remembered as one of history's greatest crimes. Indirect and direct cooperation between NATO, the UN, the African Union, and the Arab League shows the expansive and deeply woven web of US and NATO reach. We would be remiss if we didn't include the example of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC has the highest death rate of all, with some 6 million people killed, when Uganda and Rwanda, which are US proxies, invaded that country in 1996, all to ensure the uninterrupted plunder of Africa's strategic raw materials, such as cobalt, tantalum, chromium, coltan, uranium, etc. These minerals are strategically important not only for cell phones, but also for the technologies that drive the military-industrial complex. Those mentioned here are but a small sampling of NATO Africom's bloody works in Africa. The US Africom continues to operate under the guise of quote-unquote training and humanitarian peacekeeping assistance. However, jihadist terrorist violence on the African continent has increased dramatically since the founding of Africom and NATO's destruction of Libya, resulting in civilian casualties and instability. The West has used this violence as a pretext and justification for the continued use of Africom. As the Black Alliance for Peace's Africom Watch Bulletin reported, since the founding of Africom, there's also been an increase in Africom-trained soldiers, in coups by Africom-trained soldiers, consistent with what Nkrumah and Rodney and others warned of in the 60s and the 70s. NATO continues today in the form of US Africom, facilitating wars, instability, and the corporate pillage of Africa. Africom's hypocrisy also explains why there's been resistance by African countries to host the Africom headquarters in Africa, forcing it to stay in Germany. Their experiences with NATO and Africom ensure skepticism of its self-proclaimed noble motives. The US-NATO death toll inflicted on the African continent makes any claim of concern for human rights hypocritical. The Black Alliance for Peace calls for the dismantling of NATO, Africom, and all its imperialist structures. Africa and the rest of the world cannot be free until all peoples have a right of sovereignty and the right to live free of domination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Djibo.